The idea of a national northern corridor for Canada has caught on in the last 3 or 4 years, and it all started with a 2016 study from the School of Public Policy, and one of the authors was Professor Kent Fellows, who's an economist there. So we're going to talk to Kent about the latest study on a northern corridor. Welcome to the interview, Kent.
Happy to be here.
Now, look, there's all kinds of background, and that's all very interesting, and I'll post the link to the publication for anybody who wants to delve into this in detail. But I think in this interview, let's talk about why do we need a corridor, and what does it look like? So why do we need one?
I mean, one of the things that's fundamental to a well-functioning economy is being able to move goods and services throughout that economy and with your export partners. And we're not terrible at that in Canada, but we could get a lot better. And so this is, not just external trade. You hear a lot about export markets and import markets. It really is moving goods in both directions between Canadian provinces and territories, and also between us and our export markets. Anything we do negotiating trade agreements is great, but those agreements aren't worth a whole lot if we can't physically move the goods and services between these regions. So transportation infrastructure, really important to that. A corridor, really important to facilitating transportation infrastructure.
So I think we're seeing a bit of a change in the Canadian economy over time. Mining may become even more important because as we have a lot of minerals that are required for batteries now, and batteries are growing in big business. And we'll also see things like hydrogen that we might need pipelines for. And we may see, this is my take, not everybody agrees, we may see less, we may never see another oil pipeline built in this country. But nevertheless, we don't know that at this point in time. All we do know is that whatever it is that we're making, forestry, we need to get it more efficiently from here to there and off to our customers. Fair to say?
Yeah, I think exactly that. Really important to be more mode agnostic, especially if we're thinking longer term, right? And so you think back in the history of Canada, and we have these bold national infrastructure projects like the Canadian Pacific Main Line, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Trans-Canada Natural Gas Main Line, the Trans-Canada Highway. And a lot of those things are done for option value. They're done prospectively. I mean, if you go back 100 or 150 years and try to talk to the CPR about the things that they would be hauling today, I think a lot of the original framers would be mystified by what we haul via rail, that we've got propane cars that are going across the country, all this stuff. And so thinking much more longer term, important to be mode agnostic, but important to set up institutions that can actually facilitate this infrastructure growth, because that's the problem we're having in building infrastructure, is really the regulatory side of things, and making sure we're dealing with that appropriately.
Now, that actually raises an interesting question because, my degrees are in history, and I remember the national policy of 1885 and all of that. And the idea was that the the Pacific Railway would bind the country together, east to west, right? So manufacturers from Ontario go out to Western Canada, and commodities like wheat go east to Ontario and Quebec. The problem now is it seems to me, the same problem we had then, which is the trade flows quite naturally north and south. So if you were talking about electricity now, we're talking, I interviewed your colleague, Blake Schaefer here last week, and we were talking about what are you going to do? How are you going to make efficient electricity markets? Well, Manitoba to BC is one, and Ontario East is another. And it's all about within that block and north-south. And you can say that about a lot of what we do these days. So why do we need a national corridor as opposed to two regional corridors?
I mean, I think my answer to that is, there are a couple of different sides of these conversations. The first one is a national corridor doesn't have to get done all at once, right? As long as you've got a longer term plan, you can start with regional plans and then think about linking those regional plans together. North-south trade with the U.S. is important. It's still important. It's going to continue to be important. But if we think about growth markets, they're probably looking more off the continent for that. So important for, provinces in the middle of the country to be able to get their goods to the coasts, that sort of thing. There's also a concept of this shared national identity, and this is something that we've come across in later research. So a great example here is if you think about the Trans-Canada Skyway, which is a project that not a lot of people are necessarily familiar with, but this is the series of microwave towers for telecommunications across the country. That brought us the first national broadcasts of stuff like Hockey Night in Canada that were really important for Canada's shared national identity. So there are just so many different dimensions to this, and thinking about it from a federal perspective. Also, constitutionally, transportation is a federal mandate. So you hope that they will have some hand in this, in even dealing between different provinces. Then there's things about, you know, being able to get goods from Ontario to markets in Alberta. So my example is, if you're working in the oil sands and you want an oversized vessel, right now you can ship that vessel from manufacturing in the United States because you have an oversized corridor to bring it in from the south. It may be cheaper to source it in Ontario, I don't know, but we can't get it here without taking it down to the US first. So there are all these different dimensions. There's just so many things where there's potential benefits here into doing it, and doing it at a national level with a longer term strategy.
Well, I gave you kind of the devil's advocate objection to a corridor, or a national corridor anyway. But let me flip that one on its head. I mean, the economy is changing. We're getting more technology dependent. We can do things in Western Canada now that used to only be done, say, in Southern Ontario, like make cars. You could make electric vehicles anywhere, you know, the way things are going. And that, if we're going to have more flow of those kinds of goods and services, and particularly goods between regions, then a national corridor actually makes more sense heading forward than it does. Well, it just seems to make sense. You can make an argument for it.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, technology and telecommunications, if you're thinking more north, not just about the provinces, but you think about the Northern Territories, or even the northern parts of some of these provinces, so Northern Ontario, Northern Quebec, we have not been very good as a country in getting broadband, high speed telecommunications into those regions. And that really limits their ability to contribute and benefit from the rest of the economy. So, I mean, physical goods are one thing. It's great to get cheaper groceries, but even if you're trying to sell a service or buy a service and you're in the north, and I think COVID has put this into very sharp relief because we're doing so many things online, it is harder to get those connection speeds in the north. It's harder for those communities to connect. And so great for the provinces, but probably critical as we look further north into making sure that we're all benefiting from the Canadian economy.
Final question, Kent. Maybe we can wrap this up fairly quickly. How is there a movement afoot to make this the Northern Corridor a reality? Is there interest on behalf of the provincial governments and the federal government?
So I want to be a little bit careful at the school. I mean, we're not in an advocacy role; we're in a research role. But I will note that there are a number of different proposals. Some of them a little bit more regionally focused, some of them nationally focused. And we've also had very good feedback on the research agenda, in particular from the Council of the Federations. So that's the group of Canadian provincial governments and the federal government. They're generally supportive. There are holdouts. Quebec is not so big on oil pipelines being part of the corridor, but that's part of the research, and those are some of the questions that we want to continue answering. But so far, the result and the feedback has been fairly favorable, if skeptical, which is exactly what you want to hear as an academic.
Ken, thank you very much for this. Always appreciate talking to you.
Always a pleasure.